Hi everybody, welcome to week 9. The past few weeks we've been spending time on impact evaluations. Before the midterm, we worked on identifying, defining, and creating outcome measures. Then for the past 2 weeks, we've looked at the evaluation design, including creating your intervention groups or control groups, and also looking at the difference between comparison groups and control groups. This week, we are going to spend time detailing statistical approaches that evaluators use to detect, measure, and isolate program effects, including discussions surrounding the magnitude of effect, the value and role of so-called practical significance versus statistical significance, and how to find effects and how these effects demonstrate variation. At the end, we're also going to spend time going through some additional details on your final assignment. Once again, we're remaining in a holding pattern with the impact evaluations. So let's talk about program effects. Over the last few weeks, we've been primarily concerned with our research design, including our comparison or control groups and our intervention groups. Ultimately, we are seeking to provide credible evidence that our program does or does not work using the outcome measurements that the design established early on. Recall that the program effect estimates the impact of a program on an intervention by comparing the effect on the outcome against the often estimated counterfactual. So the outcomes of the program against what would have happened without the program. These program effects are the portion of the overall outcome that is attributable to the program's intervention. The magnitude of the effect is a straightforward way to assess the difference between the groups. A large effect size can indicate that a research finding has practical significance, while a small effect size indicates that it may have limited impact in real-world terms. Measurements of magnitude, then, can provide the first insight into whether a program has had an effect and a way to gauge the size of that effect. Although many outcome variables are measured on a numerical score, say a point scale, this is not often intuitively meaningful to those outside of the evaluation, nor does it necessarily translate well for later statistical approaches. As such, evaluators tend to avoid results so closely tied to the measurement instrument and rather go with options that are more widely understood. One such approach is simply to present the percent change, which reveals the percentage increase or decrease. I've put the formula as a reminder on the slide. An example is if we have a pre-measure of 42 points and then post-program we have a measure of 75 points, we calculate the percent change here, which in this case represents a 78.6% increase. However, since many outcome measurements use arbitrary units and lack a true zero, this isn't always the best approach. And so often evaluators will rely on the effect size statistic, which is more appropriate than a raw score comparison or the percentage change. This approach standardizes the outcome measurements to make them comparable to others that may use a different unit or scale. The most common effect size statistic is the standardized mean difference, which calculates the differences between the mean of the intervention group and the mean for the control group in standard deviation units. It is appropriate to use this for continuous outcome measures such as age, income, days in jail, speed, etc. Multiple calculations inform this overall statistic. We need the mean or the average for each of our groups and the corresponding standard deviation, which represents variations within our group. This allows for insights into how large the program effect is, contextualized by how much variation there is in the groups. Picture a scatter plot. If the dots all cluster closely to the average, we see low variation within the group. But if they are dispersed widely from the average, it represents greater variation. The process of calculating the SMD, or the standardized mean difference, gives us a standardized result that can be used to compare with other standardized statistics for a different measurement instrument. The resulting number under the SMD effect size represents direction and size in terms of standard deviations. When it is positive, it means the outcomes for the intervention group are XX standard deviations more positive than the control group. When negative, it represents that the control group is X standard deviations more positive. Sometimes our outcome is binary rather than continuous. A person stops smoking or they don't. A person is the victim of violence or they are not. A person graduates or they do not. Due to the difference in the type of outcome variable, we must choose a different way of detecting and assessing the magnitude of a program effect. For binary outcomes, we tend to use an odds ratio to determine the magnitude of program effect. An odds ratio indicates how much smaller or larger the odds of an outcome event are for the intervention group compared to the control group. An outcome of 1.0 represents even odds, meaning that each group was equally likely to experience the change in outcome. A value greater than 1 indicates that the intervention group was more likely to experience change, while a value of less than 1 indicates that the intervention group was less likely to experience change than the control group. The odds ratio are typically presented as proportions in a 2x2 table. In this 2x2 table, which I have on the screen, P represents the proportion of individuals in the intervention group with positive outcome. 1 minus P represents the proportion in the intervention group with a negative outcome. Similarly, Q represents the proportion of individuals in the control group with a positive outcome, and 1 minus Q represents the proportion in the control group with a negative outcome. And finally, P over 1 minus P represents the odds of a positive outcome for an individual in the intervention group, and Q over 1 minus Q represents the odds of a positive outcome for an individual in the control group. For the purpose of our course, be aware of what approach we might use and when and why we might undertake it. For those who are keen on the stats side of things, feel free to explore. But as this isn't a methods course, for what we're doing, I need you to know more about what, when, and why rather than the how to calculate them. I also want you to understand that what the results indicate. For example, if an odds ratio is 1.25 versus say 1.0, say versus minus 1.25. In addition to the magnitude or size of the effect, all effect size statistics also have a valence. We alluded to this in the previous slide, but the valence is the term used for the direction of the effect, which is often represented and indicated by a positive or negative result. It stands for whether the intervention group or the control group had more favorable outcomes. The evaluator must interpret the results being mindful of the way the outcome was constructed. An outcome for literacy is likely to be intuitively measured, where positive results indicate an increase in literacy rates. Comparatively, an outcome for criminality is likely to be counterintuitive. Negative scores indicate less criminality, which is actually the goal and represents a positive. As we've been speaking about, the magnitude refers to how big or small the statistical effect is numerically, representing the difference in outcome effects between the intervention group and the control group. Yet, these statistical effect sizes may not be truly accurate. There are always additional factors that influence them, whether it be remaining bias, pure luck, measurement error, and other sources of chance variation. This is where statistical significance testing comes in, to report on the likelihood that the results of the effect size we see is unlikely to happen by chance. However, before choosing to move forward with tests of statistical significance, the evaluator should pause and reflect upon the program effects. A program effect should be large enough that it not only facilitates such tests, but equally importantly, that it reflects a meaningful effect. If the effect is so small that then it's hard to argue that it should be tested further. Thus, evaluators should determine the minimal detectable effect size, or the MDES, before undertaking further tests. This refers to specifying the smallest effect size that has practical significance. This is determined by referring back to the program's intent, objectives, and outcome measures. By knowing the minimum threshold for effect size, it allows the rest of the impact evaluation to be constructed to detect effects that are as large or larger than that minimum. Determining the MDES can be complicated because it will depend on the program and need area involved, as well as the target population and stakeholder expectations. A program effect that is small can still represent a highly meaningful or practical effect. Similarly, what may measure as a large effect may still not reflect such a meaningful or practical outcome. In order to determine the threshold for practical significance, we need to essentially translate the statistical effect size into terms or concepts that are relevant to the social program. Sometimes this is easy because the metric makes sense to those working in the field. For example, an outcome measurement of high school dropouts may use an easily understood measure like dropout rates. On the other hand, some outcomes are particularly complex and less simple to translate. Take, for example, a psychosocial program that utilizes a complex survey-style measurement instrument, which produces a weighted total at the end. While the external experts who developed the instrument may be well-versed in interpreting the results, most of the stakeholders may not be. One way to translate the result is to compare it with other groups so that it helps people understand whether the effect size is of practical value. Sometimes a pre-existing threshold exists. often as a standard within a field such as mental health or addictions, or the threshold can be developed. If this is the case, it allows our program's effect size to be compared against it. When such thresholds do not exist or cannot be readily created, evaluators will consult existing literatures on similar programs to identify the distribution of effects found in the evaluations of similar programs or programs with similar outcomes. Evaluators have several common ways to describe the practical significance of statistical effect sizes. Difference on the original measurement scale is when the outcome measure is intuitive to understand. The effect size can be explained simply as the difference between the outcome for the intervention and control groups on that measure. Another approach is to compare with test norms or performance of a normative population. In brief, this approach states program effects in terms of the extent to which the program effect reduces the gap between the pre-intervention outcomes and the mainstream level. When norms exist for the need area, they can be compared against. We can also look at differences between criterion groups. Some programs offer the program differently to two or more groups, such as a difference in treatment approaches, dosage, frequency, or the like. In these cases, the evaluator may choose to compare those differences on the respective outcome measures. For example, a mental health facility may use a depression scale at intake to distinguish between patients who can be treated on an outpatient basis and more severe cases that require inpatient treatment. Program effects measured on that depression scale could be compared with the difference between the inpatient and the outpatient intake scores to assess how they compare with that well-understood difference. We may choose to look at the proportion over a diagnostic or other pre-established success threshold. Sometimes a value on the outcome measure can be picked to be the threshold for success. In this case, we simply look at the proportion of the intervention group with successful outcomes, which means they were above that threshold, compared to the proportion of the control group with such outcomes. We may choose to look at a proportion over an arbitrary success threshold. One of the most well understood representations of success is when it is reported as a rate. So expressing a program effect in terms of a success rate may help depict its practical significance. Sometimes there may not be a pre-established notion of what a successful rate looks like, and the threshold may be fairly arbitrary. Additionally, we may do a comparison with the effects of similar programs. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes referencing prior studies of similar programs can help to situate and translate the statistical effect size by providing a comparison of effects for similar programs on similar outcomes. This can help to contextualize what may be considered a small or large effect. And finally, we may use conventional guidelines. Often in the broader social science research field, there are some generally established guidelines for what constitutes small, medium, and large effect sizes. For standardized mean difference effect sizes, for example, 0.20 is suggested to be a small effect. 0.50 is considered to be a medium effect, and 0.8 a large one. However, keep in mind that these were put forward to illustrate the role of effect sizes in statistical power analysis. While it may not always be the best choice, when other options are lacking, it can be an acceptable set of guidelines for judging the magnitude of intervention effects. Once we've concluded that the statistical effect size has practical effect too, then we may be ready to delve into testing for statistical significance. We know that our effects are estimates, and we know that we cannot assume that it is an exact estimate of the true effect. We mentioned earlier statistical noise. Chance factors, measurement error, remaining bias and sampling error, and external influences can impact our estimate. We need to separate our program effect from this noise. In particular, sampling error, which can be called the luck of the draw that produced our intervention and control groups, is of central importance. Even the most carefully constructed sampling design can result in groups that are unrepresentative of the whole. This is especially true of small samples. They are less likely to be representative of the whole target population. Statistical significance testing is interested in identifying whether the observed effect estimate is larger than what was likely to have occurred merely as a result of the sampling error. Meaning, we want to know that the effect is a true reflection of the program impact on a representative sample of the target population and not due to the luck of the draw or chance at play with the sampling method. Traditionally, tests of statistical significance produce what is called an alpha value, which ranges from 0 to 1. Alpha values that are less than 0.05 are typically deemed statistically significant, although this level can be made more stringent by looking for values that are less than 0.01 or even 0.001. Or it can be extended to a wider window at, say, 0.1. An alpha value of 0.05 represents a 95% level of confidence that the results are not due to chance, while an alpha set at 0.001 gives us a 99% confidence that our results are not due to chance. Obviously, the more stringent the alpha level, the more confidence we have in our result, but it will take a lot more to achieve that. A less stringent alpha level will potentially mean that we don't need as much statistical power to achieve significance, but it reduces our confidence that the observed effect is not due to chance. Statistical significance is highly dependent on the statistical power of our statistical model. Statistical power is the probability that the estimate of the program effect will be judged to be statistically significant if an effect of that size is determined through an impact evaluation to have occurred. Power helps us determine how large of a sample size we need, and we need to plan for it early. 4 factors determine statistical power: the sample size, the alpha level threshold for statistical significance, the statistical significance test used, and the effect size to be detected. So let's start with the effect size to be detected. This reflects the minimum detectable effect size that has been established. Remember, the MDES dictates that the impact evaluation has to be designed to detect effects that are as large or larger than that of the determined minimum. The sample size. The larger the sample size, the more power the statistical model will have. The alpha level threshold for statistical significance. As we discussed, the alpha level provides a threshold for what will be considered statistically significant. The higher the threshold, the more statistical power we have. Related to this are type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 2 errors represent failing to find statistical significance when there is, in fact, a real effect. This means that we might erroneously say that the effects we see are due to chance and not give the program due credit. The higher we set our threshold for the alpha value, the higher the chance of type 2 errors. On the flip side of this is type 1 errors, which is when we find statistical significance when there is no real effect. The lower we set our alpha value threshold, the more likely we are to experience type 1 errors and say that the observed effects were due to the program when they were really just due to chance. Finally, the statistical significance test used. Choosing the most appropriate test of statistical significance is not always straightforward. The evaluator must consider baseline covariates in the statistical model applied in the analysis. Covariates that are correlated with the outcome measure to help isolate the variability of the outcome measure itself from the analysis of the actual program effect. A useful covariate will be pre-intervention measures of the outcome variable itself, as pre-test measures are expected to have a relatively large relationship with the post-test measures, and that can thus boost the statistical power. Such designs include analysis of covariance, multiple regression, structural equation modeling, and repeated measures analysis of variance. Striking the perfect balance is an art, and sometimes concessions need to be made. Smaller MDES require a bigger sample size to achieve anything near adequate statistical power. Often such levels are impractical given the size limitations of the target population, potential sample, and resource restraints. This is even more true for multi-level designs. This can result in underpowered statistical models, which increases the likelihood that the results of the analysis will not be statistically significant, even if they are practically significant as specified by the MDES. This result is often interpreted as a failure of the program to produce effects, which is both an incorrect interpretation of the findings and an incorrect conclusion about the program. As we know, there are often subgroups within a target population, and we should not assume that the overall mean effects hold true for all subgroups or all outcomes. The variations between subgroups can be extremely useful to extract. To do so, we bring in other variables in addition to the primary outcome variable or measure and related covariates. These variables help to define the subgroups and are called moderator variables. These variables are used in moderator analysis to identify the variations, and common ones include sex, gender, age, race and ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. This type of analysis can assist stakeholders in identifying useful information, such as who the program benefits most. Best practice is to identify these various groups prior to the start of the impact assessment so that they can be accounted for and not introduce selection bias. One significant advantage among many of this approach is that it allows the evaluator to potentially see large effects for a subgroup that may have otherwise been masked by the outcomes in larger aggregate groups. It reminds evaluators to not only base conclusions about the program effectiveness on the overall average effects. Variation can also present itself as mediator relationships among outcome variables. In our context, a mediator variable is a proximal outcome that changes as a result of exposure to the program and then in turn influences a more distal outcome. In other words, this variable serves as a causal link between the program and the immediate effect. Mediation tests whether the effect of our independent variable, which is our program, on y, our outcome of interest, operate through a third variable. It helps to address the how relationship by giving us insight into the change process. So that brings us to the end of a fairly condensed Week 9, Chapter 9 summary. I just want to update the syllabus for us quickly. I want to call your attention to Week 10 and 11 particularly. Let's switch the reading and content for Week 10 and 11. So that means for next week, I want you to read Chapter 11. And then for Week 11, I want you to read Chapter 10. For Week 12, our final week, we will be back to having our week and our chapters matching. So for Week 12, you will read Chapter 12. Also, as a note, Week 12, that's April 2nd for the in-class portion, we're going to hold the whole thing online only. I'm going to record the lecture, we're going to wrap up the course, go through the exam details, and then by the end of the day, by 11:59 p.m., all of your final papers will be due on Blackboard. So just to clarify, Week 12, we will only have online content. We will not have an in-class portion. So let's get into some of the details about this final assignment. I gave you a sneak peek or preliminary overview in the course syllabus, but now I want to detail out more about it for you guys. So let's talk about evaluation proposals and evaluation plans to begin with. So just as using a roadmap facilitates progress on a long journey, an evaluation plan can clarify what direction your evaluation should take based on priorities, resources, time, and skills needed to accomplish the evaluation. The process of developing an evaluation plan in cooperation with an evaluation work group of stakeholders will foster collaboration and a sense of shared purpose. Having a written evaluation plan will foster transparency and ensure that stakeholders are on the same page with regards to the purpose, use, and users of the evaluation results. Moreover, use of evaluation results is not something that can be hoped or wished for, but must be planned, directed, and intentional. A written plan is one of your most effective tools in your evaluation toolbox. An evaluation plan can create shared understanding of the purposes, use, and users of the evaluation results, foster that program transparency to stakeholders and decision makers, increase buy-in and acceptance of methods, connect multiple evaluation activities, and this is especially useful when a program employs different contractors or contracts, serves as an advocacy tool for evaluation resources based on negotiated priorities and established stakeholder and decision maker information needs. It can help to identify whether there are sufficient program resources and time to accomplish desired evaluation activities and answer prioritized evaluation questions, assist in facilitating a smoother transition when there is staff turnover, facilitate evaluation capacity building among partners and stakeholders, provide a multi-year comprehensive document that makes explicit everything from stakeholders to dissemination to use of results, and it can facilitate good evaluation practice. We'll speak more about this next week. Chapter 11 is a good reference, and that's why we're going to switch the readings to take care of Chapter 11 next week in preparation for this final assignment and to help support you in this final assignment. So let's talk about your task. Your task is first to identify a social program that has substantial information online about it. It can be a newer program or a well-established program. It can be anywhere in the world and target any social need area. And it's probably easiest if you find a tangible, already working program, a program that has a lot of information already in existence about it so that it can help you identify the components that you need to be able to speak to in this final assignment. Your need area can be any social need area. Some areas you might want to look at are related to education, health, food security, homelessness, mental health, literacy, justice, crime, programs for the aging population, programs for children, programs for teenagers, gender and sexuality related programs, anti-violence programs, sexual health programs, etc. Your second step is I want you to do some research on this program. I want you to gather as much as you possibly can and identify the resources you have online or otherwise to support this project. And part of that is to determine whether your program has an evaluation already completed and available to you to review. If this is the case, you need to be careful because this final assignment is not simply to regurgitate what another evaluation of the program did. It is to create a proposal for a new evaluation. The third thing you are tasked with is to put on your evaluation hat. I want you to assume that you are tasked by your stakeholders to plan an impact evaluation, and I want you to think through the lens of an evaluator, asking the questions that an evaluator would need to ask, gathering the information that an evaluator would need to gather. So what are you going to be writing about? There's a fairly common structure. It's very similar to a research plan if you've ever completed one of those. But there's some main sections that I want you to target. I expect all of these to be addressed. If you need to break it down further into smaller chunks with some subheadings or additional major headings, that is fine. I would highly recommend the use of headings. It helps to structure the document. It helps to lead your reader through your document, and it's standard practice. People use headings in professional applied technical papers such as this. So your first section is going to be your purpose and background. You're going to outline your evaluation purpose, including stakeholders, funders, those that commissioned it, etc., as well as the intended recipients and use for this plan. Remember, you're not developing the program, you're not describing how you would implement a program, you're describing how you would evaluate the program. You're creating a plan for that evaluation. I want you to give me the program background and history, including the magnitude and severity of the need area, the purpose of the program, the objectives, the intended outcomes, the intended time frames, etc. I want you to introduce this program to me, give me the context, give me the details. Speaking of those details, I want you to speak to size, locations, history, target population, services offered, etc. I want you to explain the program foundations, the process theory, the program theory, service utilization plan, operational plans, I want you to connect the pieces we've been talking about and now speak to them in terms of this real program. And finally, in this section, I want you to complete a logic model. I want you to describe the processes, the inputs to the program, the outputs, the outcomes. I want you to describe all of that, but I also want you to create a logic model visualization. And I'm going to give you a template to work from. You can use that, you can modify it, you can create your own, but I want to see both of those. I want to see both the visual representation of the logic model, but also at least a brief walkthrough of that logic model, because the logic model contains all the program's moving parts and how they connect and how the program generates change and generates its intervention through the combination of these components, such as the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, etc. The second component that I want you to spend some time on is the development of evaluation or research questions. I want to see a minimum of 2 well-crafted evaluation questions, up to a maximum of 5. These should reflect the objectives of your evaluation and shall consider the theory of change, intended outcomes, and possible stakeholder needs. Remember, the evaluation questions literally guide the rest of the evaluation. So spend some time on these and develop some articulated questions that represent your program. They should be specific and they should be customized to the program you're looking at. Another component I want you to work in is your work plan or steps to completion. So this is basically your evaluation timeline. This can be completed in what's also known as a Gantt chart, which I'll provide an example of. This is saying from the time of proposal through to the time of the dissemination of the evaluation results, what is the timeline? What is the sequence of events that needs to happen? Who do you need to engage? At what point do you need to gather data? So on and so forth. Next up is your evaluation design and data collection component. Here you're going to be talking about your strategies, your sampling, your use of comparison or control groups, approaches, limitations, concerns, etc. This is going to be followed by your data analysis section, which is going to include details about your methodology and techniques, your indicators and outcome measures, and how you're going to interpret whatever results you were to gather. Remember, you're not actually doing the evaluation. You're not going to have data to interpret, but you can explain to me, pretend I'm a stakeholder, explain to me how you would interpret your results, how you would determine what success is versus what failure is, how you might determine what substantial successes versus less meaningful change. And then finally, I want you to wrap it all up. I want you to do a results and dissemination type section. It's basically your conclusion. And what it's doing is you're taking your reader full circle. You started with your program and your evaluation questions. You told me how you're going to evaluate it in distinct, nuanced detail. You told me what you're going to do with the data, how you're going to analyze it, what the results of the analysis might tell you. And then you're going to bring that full circle to me to say, and that's how I'm going to answer the questions. That's how I'm going to answer those evaluation questions that directed it. Everything should lead back to answering those evaluation questions. And yes, you will not have the answers yet because you're not doing the evaluation yet. You're getting yourself set up for the plan, the roadmap that will guide every step of the evaluation if you were to complete it. Additionally, I want you to think about your dissemination, how you're going to share the information that you get and the results that you get, and in a meaningful way. Who needs to know what? That should tie in, you guessed it, your stakeholders once again. And those are your main sections. Those are the main components of your evaluation plan or your evaluation proposal. And like I said, if you are familiar with writing a research proposal, it is similar, but always bring it back to evaluation. Remember, the difference between evaluation and just research on a program is the evaluation is seeking to determine the worth of the program, not just the outcomes, but what those outcomes mean in terms of change in people's lives and whether or not a program should be deemed a success or not, which will inform policy and decisions that are made from it. So this paper, the intentions of it are that it's going to demonstrate your breadth of knowledge of the course content and your ability to link and apply the concepts we've covered over the past number of weeks together into an applied product. It's going to be written with your stakeholders in mind. Remember, treat me as a stakeholder. Speak to your stakeholder needs in your paper. Your paper needs to follow a formal writing style using appropriate APA style citations and references when incorporating supporting literature. This includes 1-inch margins, 12-point font, double-spaced with page numbers, a reference list, and a title page. I'm looking for these to be approximately 2,000 words in length or about 8 pages double-spaced. If you're a little short or a little long, that's fine. I'm not docking marks for being right on the 2,000 word goal here. Your title page and your reference list, I'm not counting that in the approximate 8 pages, so don't worry if you end up with a reference list. Some of you will, no doubt, so don't worry about that taking up some of your page count. I'd rather you do a little bit of look into your program and program area to help situate and provide context for your program and not worry about the reference list taking up space. This paper is going to account for 30% of your final mark as I outlined in the syllabus, and I will be providing a grading rubric and I'll share it on Blackboard along with many of these instructions that I've spoken to. Submission. It's going to be due our final class. So Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. Anything submitted after that will be subject to penalty. And if you are going to be handing it in late, I really suggest you reach out to me to give me a heads up. Additionally, the actual process of submission, please save your paper as a PDF. This ensures that what you submitted is what I see. We've all experienced it at one time or another where a paper loaded from one computer to another computer just doesn't display properly or the formatting gets a little bit messed up. Submitting as a PDF ensures that what you submit is what I see, so it's good for you and it's good for me. I want it to be uploaded to the final assignment folder on Blackboard. So please do not email it to me. Please do not somehow try to drop off a physical paper to me. Only on Blackboard in the final assignment folder, saved as a PDF. Lastly, for those of you who may not have had the chance to give it much thought yet, or you might be scratching your brain just trying to figure out what programs might be suitable for a evaluation plan like this, here's a list of a few options that I thought of that might be good options for this paper. I haven't looked into them extremely closely, so I would absolutely recommend that if you're interested in looking into any of these, you assess the amount of information that is available on these programs, because you need to be able to identify objectives and outcomes and potential measurements that you could create, and think about how you might measure them. So you need to have that level of detail available to know the nuances of the program so that you can start to brainstorm an appropriate evaluation for it. But a lot of these are well-known programs. I would suspect that they do have quite a bit of information available out there on them. Use them to inspire you, or if one of these really does catch your attention, feel free to use one of these ideas. And that's it for this week. It's a bit shorter this time. I did it in anticipation that in class we would probably have some conversation and discussion, which would take up some time. As always, I'm available for any questions, so as they come up, feel free to email me or reach out on Blackboard and let's connect over it. And until then, I will wish you a good week, and I will see you next week, where we will cover not the Chapter 10 material, but the Chapter 11 material. Have a great week.